Hi, everybody. Hi, and welcome to your branding seminar. I'm Brianna Hansen, and I'm the Director of Writer Outreach here at Roadmap Writers, and my headphones are tangled. And this is going to be fun. So basically what this is obviously it's a recording, so it's not the interactive portion of your webinar, but what I'm going to do is chat about brand for you. I'm a huge fan of brand, huge proponent of brand for reasons that I will go into throughout the course of this lecture, but the way that we're hoping that this will work is you'll watch this recording and use the information to apply it to your own self and find your own brand, so that when we come together as a group, when we come together, then we can go over person by person and chat about your specific brand, the ideas that you have, kind of what you're coming up with. The biggest takeaway, I hope, will be the creation of a personal log line, which is something I will get into here in a second in my little lecture that I have ready for you. If you have any questions between now and when you watch this and when we meet up, my email is brianna@roadmapwriters.com. I'm more than happy to answer those, chat about the stuff, answer any other questions you have outside of brand or how to approach it or anything like that. Please don't think that because this is a recording that there's no contacting me before the first session. That's certainly not the case. This is just, a fun way to do this. So hopefully you can do it on your own time. Okay, so let's talk for a second about the goal of finding your writer personal brand, and what I hope you get out of not just this lecture, but this entire branding clinic itself. First and foremost, I want you to walk away with your personal logline, like I mentioned. That will be a big topic of what I'm about to get into. So hopefully, it's enjoyable for you. But also, I hope that you walk away with, more importantly than that, much more importantly, I would say, are a clear vision of what your personal brand is, and the tools to continue to tweak and hone that brand in the future. So in a lot of the sessions that we teach at Roadmap, or that I'm sure you've taken elsewhere, we focus a little bit more, the focus is a little bit more on like the writing process or the creation of a portfolio or the improvement of that like written portfolio. And although this is certainly something that we hope supplements your writing process and your portfolio, this is sort of different in that it is taking a step away from that creation process and taking a step away from that, like, the craft itself, and looking at you as a human and as a creative and as a writer as a whole. And in doing so, hopefully understanding how we package you better so that you can sell yourself better, not sell your soul, okay? We are not asking you to sell your soul to the devil, but the reality is we are wanting anyone who's taking this, anyone who's working in these seminars and our workshops, to get traction in the entertainment business, in the entertainment industry. And in order to do that, we have to recognize that there's like the creative, wonderful elements of like, yes, I could sit around all day and write imaginary things and they're so fun, and I'm creating characters and it's all delightful. And then there's also the like pragmatic element of like, how do I get those things seen by people, read by people, done properly? How do you get it out there? So this is definitely a bit of a focus on, now it's less pragmatic because it is sort of a personal journey, but it is a focus on essentially like, commodifying yourself, like commodifying your ideas so that you can hopefully stand out a bit better. There's a lot of goals behind creating this brand in addition to what I've already mentioned, but those are the tangible takeaways I hope you have. So a quick background on me, so that you're like, why is this like person who definitely needs to get her hair done talking to me right now? Like, what's your deal? What's your deal, babe? Well, my deal is I'm an actor and writer, and the reason I'm very much both of those things. I vacillate between the two really equally. And so the reason I like to bring up the actor background is not just so that you are like, wow, she's really good at finding the camera. No, but also because, more importantly, because actors are obsessed with brand. And so I'm a SAG actor. We have branding workshops regularly at SAG. I've been working on this stuff for a long time. And several years ago, it sort of hit me that the type of focus that actors do on brand could be tweaked, but still applied to writers, and I think be just as effective and hopefully really helpful in the same way that it helps actors. So that was sort of the impetus for the creation of this branding idea. I'm certainly not the first person to think of this. My God, like lots of people have a good sense of their brand. So that's not why I tell you that. I tell you that because that's what the approach to this particular branding seminar is like directly and deeply inspired by the same philosophical ideas behind the branding process for actors. So hopefully that explains that, and hopefully that explains why I use my hands so much and I'm so animated, because actor. Okay, so let's talk about what is a personal brand. First and foremost, your personal brand is, you ready for this? It's your truth. Now, I'm not saying that because I yoga regularly. I'm saying that because I truly believe like it is the truth of who you are as a human. It is your voice. It is your distinct and unique point of view that the lens through which you see the world. So, the reason I start with this sort of, umbrella esoteric statement of like, it's your truth, is because it truly is like, who are you? What are you? What are you as a storyteller, and what are you trying to tell? What stories are you trying to tell? Thematically, which I'll get into later, but thematically, we all kind of want to say something. There's something that we are working through, either events in our past or ideas that we're fascinated by, things we're passionate about, whatever, that we're working through that we desperately want like to convey in a unique and distinct way. And so I think starting with something like understanding that it is essentially like who you are is your brand. Now, who you are is also way more complicated than the brand we're going to be creating for you for these purposes, but the idea is the same. It is, when people talk about wanting to find representation, a lot of times they'll say representatives love to find, they have a neat voice. I was so drawn to their voice, right? So sometimes it's helpful to look back and go like, what is my voice? Now, the discovery of that is a lifelong discovery, but there are times where we get closer to understanding what our strengths are. And so your voice and your truth will help you understand that. Like just having like a one-on-one session with yourself of like, who am I? Who am I distinctly? And what is it that I am trying to tell is super helpful. For the purposes of your brand, and this is so personalized to you, for the purposes of your brand, it's not something I want you to feel like boxed in by. A lot of times people are hesitant to be open to the idea of branding themselves because they're afraid that like, oh, if I brand myself, if I say this, then I write other types of things. And that's fine. That's great. And in fact, like, again, this is where the acting kind of background comes in. Every actor believes that they can do any role you throw their way, but it doesn't help you logistically as an emerging writer, specifically as an emerging writer attempting to find your brand. It doesn't help you to say you can write anything. It helps you to say, these are the stories I tell the best. These are the types of stories I'm drawn to, and this is what I'm most interested in telling and sharing with the world. And I'll get into later thinking about that much more thematically and not like literally genre-wise, right? But in the thought and creation of that, I think that's just really helpful to know that you're not boxing yourself in, because this is really, especially for emerging writers, all about getting a seat at the table. Once you have a seat at the table, you know, whether that's a writer's table, like a literal table, or just a, hypothetical seat at the success table, whatever that looks like. Once you have a sense of that and you have some clout behind you, you are welcome to, and I encourage you to, and please do pivot all you want, but it's not a bad thing to be known as like the rom-com lady or whatever, which is sort of a bad example for reasons I'll get into later. But for example, let's say you're like, I love rom-coms, and I've worked with writers who love rom-coms. That's what they write. Great. So like you're the rom-com, you love love stories. Awesome. So if that's your brand and that's what you are, cool. Once you've sold a couple, then you could use those connections and that clout that you have to perhaps shift and pivot into something else. But this is, so it's not like a bad thing to work. So please don't feel boxed in by brand is what I'm saying. So all that to say, a little edit there, we're smooth, we're all good. All that to say, don't worry about being boxed in. And also this is meant to be something that gets you traction and gets you going and gets you help so that you figure out whether or not this even, this brand works for you. So don't feel boxed in by the choice that you may make during either this seminar or future seminars. You're welcome to let this exploration of brand be like an exploration of self. Like if it feels right, great. If it's not working, then let's tweak and let's adjust. Okay. Cool. So your brand is also not something, the reason I'm so obsessed with saying it's about like your personal truth is because it's really not about being responsive to what's happening in the industry right now. I say that because sometimes people will be, and it's a good thing to be this way, but be really up on the trades and to be like, oh, look, there's a lot of, for example, female driven sci-fi dark comedies coming out. Wouldn't that be fun? But let's say that that's the case, right? Then they're like, okay, so I'm going to brand myself as a person who writes female-driven dark sci-fi comedies because I have one in my portfolio, and so therefore I can, make it work. I don't think that that's as effective. That's why I'm a firm believer in it really being like, I tell stories about, this type of stuff, whatever it may be for you, and I'll get into some details of how to find and discover and curate that soon. So don't make it responsive. And the other thing is a huge reason for that is, and there's 1,000 of them, but among them is because the second we're hearing about things being produced in the trades, the second that we're hearing about that, as an emerging writer, branding yourself as that, and it makes it harder to like get a seat at the table because those tables are probably already filled with people writing those shows or working on those projects. And so the next big wave of things could be the thing that you're actually really strong about, but you were trying to, pretend like you were something else. Anyway, never pretend like you're something else for the purposes of your brand. Let's keep it honest, keep it truthful. And most importantly, your brand is something I think that, you can go back to. You can go back to the drawing board. I'll get into this a little bit later, but it's something that you can be like, okay, I don't know what I'm going to write next, but I know that these are the types of stories I want to tell. So let me look at the list of log lines I have, and figure out how, or maybe I don't have a list of log lines. Maybe it's just like, I know that now that I get a better sense of who I am as a writer, now that I get a better sense of what I'm really trying to do as a brand, what the stories I'm really trying to tell within that brand, now that I have a sense of that, is there a story I can tell that like really strongly encapsulates that? Like, is there a way to really shine my voice through this brand? So hopefully it's all those things for you and more. Okay, so some benefits of having a brand. Now that I've told you, like, what is it? Some benefits if you don't already instinctively, intuitively know, and many of you may. But some benefits are, first and foremost, it can give you some great confidence. And I'm not saying that so that you're like, oh, I have to be pure confident. I'm saying that because like knowing who you are and the types of stories that you want to tell, it changes the dynamics of a conversation. If you're meeting with executives, sometimes I feel like, and this happens for actors and writers, I feel like we're on one side of the table going like, oh, please hire me. And the other side's like, I'm the power. And not, this is our perception of the other side, not actually how they are, but like, I'm the power and I have the power to make or break your career, right? And instead, if you really know who you are and what you bring to the table, then your energy can shift from like, oh, please hire me, into like, I know what I bring to the table and this is what I'm really good at. Is this something that would benefit you guys? Is this what you all are looking for? Can this be a symbiotic, a collaborative relationship that we can create? Hopefully so. But I think it takes, I don't want to say the power dynamics back because they were never actually that distinct to begin with. But I do think it can really, 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 really help you to have confidence in your voice and to have confidence in who you are and what you're good at. That's the biggest thing. That's why I'm obsessed with saying your brand is like, it's what you're best at. It's not the thing, like, of course you can do everything. I hope you can do everything. But what are the things that you are most drawn to, you are most passionate about, and you feel really strongly based on who you are, what you've been working on, the story, everything leading up to this point of you as a writer. What are you best at? And by best, I mean just like the strongest passion towards, because that will then be very distinct and clear, and that will attract, other people. Like walking into a room saying I can write anything is not memorable. Walking in and having a really distinct saying like I write female driven sci-fi dark comedies. You know, if you do that, great. But I'm saying like something like that is like, oh, that's memorable. I know where to place you on the puzzle that I'm trying to fill of like the, you know, I've got a roster that does this and I don't have anyone who does that. That's interesting. Or if there's got this writing assignment, anyway, you become more memorable. I think it can also help you to focus. Again, I sort of mentioned this, but if you aren't sure what project to work on next, because I would love to pretend like, and I know we all would, that writing is this like beautiful, artistic, you know, we're always like in this great world of just the muse is whispering to us. We can't type fast enough. But the reality is a lot of writing is a grind. And sometimes when you finish a project, or at least you get like a really good draft of a project prepared or ready or whatever, when that's done, you know, you gotta do another. You gotta just keep going. Now you gotta get that out there. Of course, there's still work to be done on that, but the reality is you have to keep writing. And so, in the decision to keep writing, and the decision to move forward of like, what do I want to do next? Hopefully, better understanding your brand can give you focus on that. Is there something that an idea that you've had for a while that will really, really serve your brand now that you better understand it? Is there an idea out of left field that you have that will awesomely serve the brand? Stuff like that. You can make decisions based on this foundation. You can make decisions of who you want to pitch, the types of like festivals you want to attend, the next steps that are best for you, stuff like that. There's so much benefit from coming from better understanding who you are. And most pragmatically, it helps you to stand out in a very saturated market. There are a lot of people, and it's such a good thing because there's also a ton of stories being made and told. So it's like an amazing time to be a creative. But there are a lot of stories being told right now and a lot of people who want to tell them, and that's awesome. To help you to stand out, I think it's really, really helpful to accept the fact that you need to have a good sense of your brand. You need to have a good sense of who you are, what you want to say, and all of that jazz. So that people go, so that again, you're memorable. And then just as something that can be really helpful, like as an immediate takeaway from the sense of brand. A lot of these are like future takeaways or next time you write or like, you know, big takeaways. An immediate takeaway is having something like a personal log line, I think is really effective to use at the top of a pitch. Depending on, you know, the amount of time you have to pitch, where you're pitching, what the prep materials are for the pitch, like if they know you're coming, if you're just pitching one idea, whatever. But let's pretend for a moment that as an emerging writer, you are pitching somewhat blindly to a studio or executive or person. And let's pretend that that studio executive or, you know, representation person, whatever, that person doesn't know anything about you and also is hearing a bunch of people in a row. If that is the case, then it is so helpful, I think, for three reasons, to start with your personal log line. And I've been working on this class as of the time of this recording for a couple years. And one of the feedback that I consistently get from writers is that this is one of the most effective ways of using their brand. And they use it pretty consistently, their personal log line, which is, you know, the brand is the umbrella and the personal log line is sort of the physical takeaway from part of that umbrella. But the biggest reason, one of the reasons, is it allows the person who's listening to you to better understand you and the types of stories you tell. It should hopefully immediately lend itself into being a nice transition into talking about the thing that you want to pitch anyway, which I'll get into a little bit later, but it's very quick. The second reason is because a lot of times people will be like, how much do I talk about myself up top in a pitch? Well, the answer is, who knows the answer to anything, but my advice answer is because is a little bit, is to use this personal brand that you've created to talk about yourself just a little bit, so that they do have a sense of you as the person before you dive into the story itself. The reality is the story itself is the thing that they're most interested in. You don't want to like talk about yourself for too long because especially if your time is limited, they'll be like, well, what's the story? Tell me the story. People want to be told a story. But this allows you to sort of sneak in details about yourself types of things you want to write, the types of things you want to create, all that at the top. So then, you've got it already in there before they even realize what's happening. So that's a second reason. Then the third reason that I specifically love starting a pitch with a branding statement, if it works for you, if you like yours and it works for you in that way, comes from my background in stand-up comedy, because we would, lots of nights where there's comedian after comedian after comedian, and you never know who you're going after and what the audience's energy or response will be to that person. And so when you get on that stage, and you'll see comedians do this, and I have another, I use some of my background in stand-up comedy to reference some of these things. But you see comedians do this where like, it takes a second to settle into the new energy of the new person, because the other person has been on stage for a bit. They've got the audience feeling one way. They did good or bad. It sort of doesn't matter, but the new energy is not going to be the same as that other energy. So, so you kind of settle into, and you maybe aren't explicitly saying like, this is what you get from me, but you are implicitly saying that by taking a moment to kind of talk about yourself. So it allows for a little bit of a palate cleanser, which I think makes it really helpful for you also to get some nerves out. Like, the first thing you say, there's a lot of pressure we put on ourselves when we pitch. And so we're like, oh, I want it to be perfect. I want it to be right. Well, if you can come in just talking about yourself just a little bit and your brand just a little bit, it can ease a lot of those nerves, and it can ease a lot of that like tension, and make you feel a bit more like yourself, and sort of be a reminder, like, this is who I am. This is what I do. And then you get into it. So you're settling into your energy, and you're allowing them to get on your level, like I said, I like to gesticulate, and I've like got a lot of energy and stuff. And so if you've just come off like 2 or 3 pitches in a row that are lower energy, and then I come in hot, it's helpful to give them a second to adjust. Or if you come in subtle, there is no right or wrong, but if you come in subtle and they're coming off a bunch of like, hot pitches, it helps them to get a second to like adjust to you. So that's another reason, just pragmatically, I love to have the personal branding log line be used at the top of a pitch. Okay, so let's talk about some ways to find your brand. Let's talk about that. First and foremost, look at your body of work. What do you have written? It doesn't matter to me if your body of work is huge or if your body of work is small. I don't care. There's zero judgment, and please do the same for yourself. There's zero judgment placed on what you have done, what you have in your hands. Whatever it is that you do have, and I assume if you're taking this program or you're involved in some screenwriting programs that you have something. So I'm going to operate under the assumption that you have something that you've written. So if you have something, look at that. Look at the story that tells. If you have more than one something, look at multiple. Be like, what are these stories? Look at what's already existing. If you have a couple things and a bunch of ideas, look at your ideas. What are the ideas that are exciting enough? Like, what are you writing down? What are you drawn to? What are the most exciting things for you? Look at those and think about like, what you've already written or what you are looking forward to writing. That's the first place. Look at the second place is also look at your screenplay and the creation of the log lines that you use for a screenplay, and that will sort of help you get a sense of what you're going to do for your personal brand, which I'll get into in a second. But basically like, or your personal log line, excuse me. But basically what I mean by that is like, when you look at your screenplay, right? When you look at whatever it is, it's this like, let's say it's as short as it gets professionally in a half-hour comedy pilot, right? You're talking 30 pages. That's as short as it gets. Most people with features have like 90 something pages, right? Okay, so this is a lot of content. There's a lot of story, and you boil it down to like one sentence. That's crazy. So for your personal log line, you're going to take, and getting a sense of your brand, you're going to take your entire human life, your entire creative life, and boil that down to a couple sentences. It's a ridiculous ask. I understand that. But I think understanding the process by which we create those log lines for our screenplays, for our pilots, for our projects, whatever, will help you understand. It's a sense of like, what is this really about? What's this thing about? And so they can be like, what am I about? And you just kind of choose a lane knowing that you're leaving out a huge amount of stuff. You're leaving out, you're a complicated and interesting human being that cannot be encapsulated into a couple sentences. I recognize that. I hope you do too. But in the creation of that, just know that like, that's okay. It's okay to leave some stuff out. You're just choosing the way you want to represent yourself in the same way you choose the way that you want to represent your stories. Another thing you can look at and to find your brand is, what do you like? I think that'll help you to get a sense of like what, you know, your interests are. I know that like I come from a comedy world. I write comedy, and I write mostly comedy, which you'll hear in my branding statement in a second, which I'm going to share. But in that world, like I love watching comedy, but it's not the only thing that I watch. And in fact, understanding the other things that I watch that I'm really drawn to help inform the type of stories that I tell. So don't feel, again, limited to only your portfolio when looking at what you like. Look at what you like to watch. What are you drawn to? And then take the step back and go, why am I drawn to that? What is it about that I'm drawn to? And there's so much content out there that I know I have watched one pilot of something and been like, nope, done, not watching anything else, even though other people love it. And it's like, okay, well, that's their thing. I know what mine is, and it's just different. So it helps you also to get a sense of self. I want you to think about your brand, a way to think about your brand. I want you to think about it, and I've hinted at this already, so let me just outright say it. Think about it thematically. Do not think about it literally. So what I mean by that is I want you to, as best you can, shy away from the like, I write the following types of genres. I write dramas and this and whatever, into more of like, I write about losers trying to win their way back into the good graces of love. I write about fish out of water. I write about a family. I write about community. I write about belonging, stuff like that. Does that make sense? And you can't respond to me. So I hope that makes sense. But that's kind of the idea. It's much more thematic and not just literal. Now, if you, I have a slight caveat for comedy that I want to say here, and also for genre, but specifically for comedy. And what I mean by genre is if you write like period pieces, if you write sci-fi, if you write fantasy, and that's what you consistently write, that's great. Like listen, if you write a thing, like I said up top with the woman who, people who write rom-coms, I have one writer in mind who I love who writes rom-coms. If you specifically write one thing, like say that. Please don't feel, sometimes people just feel boxed in by the fact that they don't want to say that, or they feel like it's adding too much by being like, I write listing the things that they can write, and it sort of muddies the water, which I think it does. Instead, if you do write like genre pieces or whatever, then say that. If you pretty much only work in like the horror or the sci-fi or the fantasy space, then say like, I explore these themes through genre pieces or something like that. Like, get creative with it. My caveat for comedy is, if you write comedy and if you want to consistently write comedy, then I highly suggest you say somewhere in your personal branding logline that you say, I write comedy. Say the words. You'll hear me say that and when I share my own here in a moment. But that's specifically because comedy is the only genre that people like multi-hyphenate in, meaning like, there are comedians who also write, like who do stand-up comedy, do this, do that, much more than any other genre for the most part. And there are other genres that people do go back and forth, like they'll write their own thing, but comedy's majority of the people who do this in comedy. They tend to like write for themselves, or they write, they multi-hyphenate. So I think it's really important to specify comedy if you are a comedic writer. So that's my one like little caveat with comedy. Another way to kind of find your brand is to, and this is what I say. Okay, gosh, this works so much better when it's like live, but when it's recorded, it's like, why didn't you edit this? Well, I didn't edit it because because I'm human and we're, imperfect beings. If what I wanted to say before I get off the comedy thing is, if you have comedy in your portfolio, but you don't exclusively have comedy, or you are not only looking to do comedy in the, future or whatever, like if you're like, it just happens to be I have a couple of these things that have deep comedy elements or they're comedic or whatever, then I suggest you find a way of including in your brand, like I include levity, I make sure that there's a good sense of humor, I include lightness or something. Have something else that you say that doesn't include some, I write some comedy or whatever. Like find a way to, again, think thematically about that and allow it to sort of feed the creative way that you come up with saying it. But you don't necessarily need to say I write comedy and this and that or whatever, because it is its own genre, and the expectations of the pacing of what come from a comedy portfolio typically aren't found in a dramedy, and typically aren't found in stuff that has like, comedic elements or whatever. Because basically if you hand someone a comedy, they're like, how many jokes per page? Like there's like, I assume that I'm going to be laughing. Like there's all these things involved in that. If you hand them a dramedy, then it's like, oh, there's lightness. How nice is that? But it's not the expectation, right? The pacing's different. So I encourage you to, if you have comedy in your portfolio, but it is not the only thing you're pursuing, or you're not actively being like, I want to be a comedy writer in a comedy room, to find another way to say it, to find a way to be true to that and to you. And then, okay, then the last thing about how to find your brand is think about where you want to be as a writer. What type of career do you want to have? So I worked with this one writer years ago who was the most prolific person that I've ever known. I mean, she had thousands of books, screenplays, pilots, all of them had treatments. I mean, incredible body of work. So for her, finding a brand was particularly difficult because she probably had written about everything under the sun. So our focus was then, and this is why I bring her up for this now, is to think about like, okay, great. So you have everything under the sun, or your portfolio feels like it's all over the place. Okay, cool. So let's just like take a step back and go, if tomorrow you were living your dream creative life, you were just optioned by an amazing company, what company would that be? And who are you going into development with? Who's the director that you're working with, that's directing this feature that you have? Because you want to write features or whatever. If it's TV, what writer's room do you want to be in? Do you want to be a showrunner? And if you're a showrunner, where do you want to work? Like what is that? Or do you want to have a certain showrunner attached to your show? What has that showrunner done? Like, what in the past or in the recent past or whatever, what are they working on now? Just think about your ideal world. And I think that will help to understand like, oh, that's where I want to go. So what do I have, and what stories am I telling that make me so drawn to that, that are so kind of similar and parallel to that. So that's the way to find your brand. I had a writer once say this, and I love it. Think about it as like the dust jacket of your book, the book of you, which is a complicated and long piece of work. If you just had to look at like the dust jacket, that'll give you a sense of like what your brand is. Like, this is the overall thing that you're going to get with this book, right? And then we're going to dissipate that even further into your personal log line. It's going to be great. Okay, so it's fun to think of it as your brand is like your origin story. Your personal log line is kind of your origin story, where you come from and what your thing is, what your superpower is, what defines you and what's your superpower. It's kind of a fun way that one of the writers talked about that. And in a moment here, I'm going to give you an example of my personal log line, which is always being changed and tweaked, but I'll give you the current running example of what my brand and log line are. I'm going to break down the formula of how I created that. But I want to say before I do that please feel free and open to talk in the context of the creation of your log line, to talk as openly about yourself and your past and your work or whatever as you're comfortable with. And that doesn't mean you have to share stuff. It just means that like in the creation of a personal brand, it's very important that you have that person, the person in the personal brand, meaning like sometimes I've had writers not want to mention that they've been doing, X and X job for whatever years, because they want to present themselves as pure professionals who only write. But the reality of the situation is, if you're pitching representation, they probably know that you're not a professional writer yet, or that you're not, you're looking to become more professional, and that's totally fine. And the work that you've done, the person part of your person, the background that you have and the work that you've done will help to inform and make you distinct. And so please don't shy away from that. Not just work that you've done, but if you've had a defining moment or whatever. And I'll get into sort of the details of how much to share later, but I just don't want you to, when you hear this in the creation processes, you're like, well, what do I talk about, or where do I even start? I worked in advertising for 40 years. And so I'm really interested in, short quips or whatever. But I don't want to say that I've worked in advertising. I mean, you can let that be informative. So all that to be said, please be open to all the assets and aspects of yourself as you think of and create this brand. Okay, so here is my personal log line. It's even weirder sharing it with no one here. So please know that wherever you are, we're sharing this moment here. Okay, so here's my current working personal log line. It's a little long for what I want. It's not terribly long. It's a little long. But the good news is I tend to talk fast. That's also part of my brand, is I talk fast with a lot of energy, so I can get away with a little bit longer. But I encourage you to keep it around this length, or ideally even shorter if you can. So so here's my log line, and then I'm going to break it down how I got there, why I chose to say the things that I did, and hopefully that's helpful for you. So hi, I'm Brianna Hansen. That's the beginning of my pitch. Okay, so my personal log line is, I have a hyperactive imagination and a sharp, often wicked sense of humor. I've always felt like an oddball, and I'm fascinated by what it means to fit in. And I don't take myself very seriously at all. So I write mostly comedies about fish out of water who attempt in their own unique way to find a sense of belonging, and in doing so become their own best advocate and worst enemy in the process. And all of my stories possess, just like yours truly, a deep and sometimes dark sense of humor. Okay, so that's essentially how I would start. Every time it's tweaked. I also don't want you to feel like this has to be perfect, because I definitely have notes here that I'm reading from, and I definitely didn't read it directly from there because it's imperfect. We're all imperfect. We're all working on it. So, but the point is, here's basically how I break down the formula. I start with something personal about myself, ideally with this first beat. So I have some personal element. For me, this was I have a hyperactive imagination and a sharp, often wicked sense of humor. Humor is very important to me. It affects everything that I write, and I'll get into that in a second, but humor is just my thing. So I use hyperactive imagination because my stuff is kind of weird, and also because it's kind of a distinct phrase. It's like a memorable phrase to be like, a hyperactive imagination. That's a weird thing to say. That's an interesting thing to say, right? So that's kind of helps to be one of my flagpoles of branding. I encourage you to find something that's an interesting way of saying. I'm not saying that hyperactive imagination is the most interesting way, but there are other ways of saying it that are probably less memorable and just as accurate. But I want something that's kind of memorable. So I have a personal element about myself that meets what I tend to write about, that personal element includes my point of view. So I say I've always felt like an oddball, and I'm fascinated by what it means to fit in. And so I write, so then that leads to, so because of this personal thing, what does it lead to? The types of things you can expect to find in my portfolio. And for me, I write mostly comedies. I have a couple outliers. I actually have one outlier. I keep saying it's a comedy, but everyone keeps saying it's a thriller. Blah. I mean, people die, but it's funny to me. Anyway, so I write mostly comedies. I'm comfortable saying that without explaining or going into deep caveats about well, except for this one thriller. And I love my thriller. I include it as a strong part of my portfolio. Anyway, so I say I write mostly comedies, right? About fish out of water. So I give my theme. Which, and again, this is not me being everything I write needs to have a fish out of water. It's literally what I saw when I was looking at my body of work, and I saw it realizing oh, I think it's because I always kind of feel like an oddball, it's that's kind of what, and I know that I was raised in a different community that so anyway, it was very clear to me that that was really thematically important and a type of story I tend to tell regularly. So, to tell about my protagonists. So personal, go into what you can expect in your portfolio, and what you can see from your protagonists. And then usually leads to like, and my protagonists are this type of person. You don't have to like use the word protagonist. You can say like, I ended with my stories possess, something like that. But you basically lead to like what sort of your ideal call to action is, why you tell the stories you do, stuff like that. So for me, like my stories possess like a deep and sometimes dark sense of humor. For me, and I include deep specifically because that word, because of what that word implies, and like some of my stuff is like weird philosophical stuff, you know what I mean? So, but it's still comedic. So it's like, what that made me think. I like when people think. I like when they're playful. I like when they're, aside. So anyway, so that's kind of what it leads to. So it's something personal leads to what you can expect in your portfolio, leads to like what is actually in your portfolio leads to the type of stories you want to tell. That's the basic breakdown of the formula. Okay. So now that you understand that, I'm going to break down, I want to talk to you about when it comes to sharing the personal thing. This is what I was saying just before I started. So it's as comfortable as you are sharing. I've had people be extremely comfortable sharing stuff, saying like, oh, I've had this thing happen, or this is a part of my physical reality or something. And it very deeply informs my stories and the things that I want to talk about. And I'm comfortable talking about it. So I'll lead with that. And then other people who are like, oh, I know exactly why I tell these types of stories, but I do not want to share that. It's not something I'm comfortable sharing. Or it's like so personal that you feel like you're going to be maybe overwhelming whoever you're pitching to, sort of talking like they're going to be like, whoa, whatever it is. If people pick up on energy. So not that I don't care about you, but I don't care what the thing is. I care how comfortable you are talking about it. I've had people be extremely comfortable talking about really dark stuff, and people be very uncomfortable talking about, relatively, I don't want to like belittle it, but like lighter things, they're just like, it just doesn't feel relevant or whatever. So it's your comfort level. The important part is you find a way to package it. So you're like, I had a rough childhood, and for example, I had a rough childhood. Movies were always my escape. So I write escapist movies so that people can, in the hopes that people have somewhere to run to if they don't. Something like that. Like, you don't have to get into details is my whole point. Then my last point on your logline itself is that it should be true. It does not have to be the truth. So this is the second stand-up thing that I'm going to say. So anytime you've ever seen a stand-up comedian say something like, oh, the other day I was washing my car or whatever. First of all, that never happened the other day. There's some element of truth in that. They probably were washing their car. There was some joke that they thought of, like something that happened. There's an element of truth in it. So it's true. But it is not the truth in that, like, it just happened the other day and it happened the exact way that they're about to go down. It's sort of something that we accept. We go, okay, cool. Because we can read when someone's lying. Like, that's the thing. Immediately you pick up on when someone's sharing a personal detail or a personal story or whatever, we can pretty easily pick up on, even if we don't know that we're doing it, there's like that sense of like, something about that doesn't feel right. Like something, I don't trust this person. I don't trust this person. So when that happens, I think that it's helpful to then say like, okay, so that's because they were like lying. And so if I want you to, that's why I started this whole thing with saying like your truth, like what is the truth about you? I say that because an old logline that I had elements of, and even with this logline I'm working with now that I like, I don't love, there are elements of it that are, everything about it is true. Some things are probably, painted in different ways to paint the portrait that I want you to see, not necessarily my actual truth. This helps me to not only separate myself from my work a little bit, be like, this is writer Brianna, this is who's showing up today, this is what you can expect from her and her portfolio. This is not the whole human Brianna, but it's also, I think, helpful because you have to know that like it has to have enough truth to it that people will believe you and feel that, but don't feel beholden to like, well, if I say that, then I have to say that, and it's not exactly accurate. No, like just give the sense of the truth and recognize that you're telling us the story of yourself, like the story of the version of yourself that you want to present. And it needs to be true enough, but it does not need to be the whole truth. All right, I've made that clear, I hope. And so the last things I want to say is, this came up a couple times specifically for me, but it was the fact that when I say, like, I've always felt like an oddball, I write about sense of belonging or whatever. There are a lot of people who probably feel thematically similar. Like, or, you know, they might be like, well, I also feel like an oddball, and some of my stories are belonging. So for me, the reason I share those is because it is the driving factor that drives the majority of the plot that, like, all of my protagonists do. So it's not even that, like, they feel like oddballs, but then they got something else. It's literally like their sense of being an oddball, their sense of being sort of out of this community, and their desire to be a part of it is what typically drives a lot of my stories, which come in different, they're always fish out of water, and they're different, like, genres, you know, that type of thing. Even my thriller fits into that, even though it doesn't necessarily fit into comedy. It is a person who feels sort of at odds with the world that she is supposed to belong to and does not know how to fit in, and so makes these somewhat terrible choices of how she is going to decide that this is how she's going to create the world she fits in. So so know that that's why I chose it. It's not necessarily, and I'm not saying other people, lots of people write about belonging, lots of people write about, like, fish out of water. That's not me trying to be like, you know, don't do that. It's just, it has come up in the past where people are like, but I also feel that, or I, like, as a writer, and I totally get that. Like, we as writers, as creatives, are often like, I feel like an oddball, or I feel like I don't belong, or whatever. And that's wonderful and beautiful. And let's all be oddballs together. But most importantly, like, how does it inform, or does it inform your portfolio, and like, look at your protagonists and their actions and why they're doing it? What is their goal? And what is your goal in writing it? And for me, like, that's the huge thing is like, I have these oddballs, and I want people to feel like it's okay to be an oddball. Like, that's part of what, you know, thematically I'm going for. And a lot of times that comes through comedy, and sometimes it doesn't. Okay. So, and also recognize that this is how, for the purposes of the creation of this, this is how you identify here and now. Whenever you are watching this, whatever, like, phase you're in, whatever it is, this is just the here and now. So we went through this whole lecture to get to this point, so that you hopefully feel empowered and understand that you can change and tweak this all the time. Like I mentioned, I used to have an old log line. Every time I say the log line that I just gave, and listen, I like the log line I just gave, but I don't love it. And it's not, I've changed from the time I originally created that a few months ago to now. It's an ongoing, you know, tweak, an ongoing change. I really want this to be something that works for you. If you don't like saying it, it's not going to work for you, because you're going to start, it's going to feel weird up top. I really want it to, you know, feel like something that accurately identifies here and now. Now I realize I said that. If you don't like saying it, and I just said, like, I don't really like my log, I like my log line. I like my log line enough to share it regularly. I like it enough. It represents me well enough, but I do need to do some of the work to, like, I've changed in the past, you know, several months since I wrote this, and my portfolio has expanded. And so I need to do the work to reflect that. Does that make sense? Rather than, I'm asking you again, I can't see you. But rather than just, like, doing it once and being like, it's done, and I don't like it, I don't use it, whatever, like, tweak it, change it, move it. I will also say one last caveat. The formula that I gave you, please, 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 please think of it as a blueprint. It is not a forced structure on you. I've had people who hate having the personal element in there. And so, so don't include it. When we meet up for our session, whenever it is after you have watched this, when we meet up for our session, and you know, give me what I hope happens is you give me your stab at a personal log line. In the creation of that, you know, if you don't like saying it, I'll be like, don't say it. Like, so let's just fix that conversation now. If you don't like saying it, don't say it. No one's going to make you say it. I think that it needs, again, to be something that you really like. This needs to be a way that you can get at it. And so don't feel beholden to that structure. It really can be whatever you want it to be. I find a lot of people get benefit from having a starting place. And so that's why I like to give the blueprint structure of this personal logline creation of this starting place. So that's it. So when we meet up, Pitch Prep Lighters, whenever that is. I'm so excited for it. But whenever that is, we are going to basically go through and everyone is going to be giving me their personal log line. And as a group, we're going to hear them. It's going to be great. It's great to do it in front of a group of people because you can really get a sense of, again, this is an internal exploration as much as it is like externally looking at the stuff. You can get a sense of how it feels to say this in front of people. Do you feel uncomfortable? Do you feel great? Like, do you feel like it accurately represents you? All of that. Please know that, again, it's a blueprint. There's no right or wrong. So whatever you feel like you're taking a stab at, just take a stab. That's all that I ask in this is, it's a weird thing. It's a personal thing. It's, it's weird to talk about yourself, but I find that it can be really effective to talk about yourself in this way because you allow yourself to sort of be the commodity, like sort of how we were starting this chat. You allow yourself to be the commodity and have a full human outside of the commodity. You're like, this is the writer version of me. This is who I present myself as, this is that. And I am more holistic and more interesting than that. You're as holistic and interesting in all these things as a human and form this writer, but they're slightly separated so that really just resilience wise. So when people reject the writer, they're, just rejecting the writer, not the human. So there's a little bit of a shield on the brand too. Okay, so that's basically it. So we're going to come together. You're going to tell me your personal log line. We're going to chat about it together. I'm going to ask you about the creation process. If you're stuck, trying to think of issues or ways to reach out, here's a couple things that I encourage people to do if you want to, and this comes directly from the acting world. If you'd like to, reach out to your network and ask some questions. Ask the questions of like, hey, if you were to read something that I wrote, if you were to, what TV show, if you were to read something that I wrote, what would you expect the story to be about? What TV show is currently on the air that you're surprised I don't write for, or something like that. Like, reach out to a few people, reach out to people who've read your work, reach out to people who have not read your work. It's helpful sometimes to, just reach out to a handful of your network and to ask them for a helpfulness with finding your brand or remembering your brand. As one might say, just remember it. You already know it, but like, remember it. Don't ask anyone you can't hear it from. Just don't open that can of worms. This is a very personal thing. So if there are people who you don't want to hear it from, don't ask them. But ask people who, are of interest. Like, ask people who you trust and that you like. The reason I like to do both people who've read your work and not is because I think sometimes the people who know you as the human will have a really good sense of you that you may be forgetting or overlooking. And that really does inform you as the writer. And then obviously people who've read your work can also give that extra outside perspective. So sometimes people will do this via email. They'll shoot out and feel free to come up with your own questions that you have for these people, but variations of like, hey, if you were to describe my writing in 3 words, what would they be? Stuff like that can be helpful. Actors do it all the time. It's the best and worst thing ever, but it's really helpful to do it sometimes and get like kind of a litmus test of what other people think. At the end of the day, you get to choose who you are and you get to choose what your brand is. So you can take everything that's said with a grain of salt. But sometimes people who do it do find, not sometimes, pretty much everyone who does it does find that there tends to be value in, oh, I forgot that thing about myself. I forgot that strength that I have, or I forgot that really is the type of stories, or this affirms what I'm hearing from my network affirms exactly what I thought my brand was. That's great. And it doesn't matter if your network gets your brand or not. You get to decide and choose it, but it can be helpful. Okay, so that's basically it. So we're going to come together and we're going to chat about those things, and I cannot wait to see and meet you all. If you have questions in the meantime, like I mentioned, Brianna at roadmapwriters.com. And thank you for watching this. Goodbye.